More than 30 years after it hit theaters, Tombstone still gets talked about like it happened yesterday. Fans quote the lines. They debate the mustaches. They argue about who really made the movie work. And at the center of almost every one of those conversations sits Sam Elliott, the man who played Virgil Earp with a stillness and gravity that made the whole Earp family feel real. But behind that steady performance is a production story that most casual fans never fully absorbed. A film that nearly fell apart in its first month, got quietly rescued by its own leading man, and somehow came out the other side as one of the most beloved westerns ever made. This is that story, pieced together from what the people who lived through it have actually said over the years. Tombstone began as the passion project of a screenwriter, not a director. Kevin Jarre, who had already made a name for himself writing Glory, wrote the Tombstone script and was set to direct it himself. His first time in the chair. It was an ambitious, sprawling piece of work, dense with historical detail and packed with characters, and it was the writing itself that pulled in performers like Sam Elliott in the first place. Elliott has been blunt in interviews about what drew him to the project. The script had teeth. It didn't feel like a watered-down formula western. It felt like something with real people in it, people with contradictions and history and weight. But writing a great script and running a large-scale period production are two very different skills, and Jarre struggled with the second one almost immediately. Reports from the set describe a first-time director overwhelmed by the demands of managing a big ensemble cast, a tight Arizona shooting schedule, and a budget that was already under pressure. Cinematographer William Fraker reportedly grew frustrated enough that he considered walking off the production more than once. Elliott himself has said he sensed the trouble early, by his account. He knew within the first few days that Jarre wasn't getting the shots the production needed. About a month into filming, the studio made the call. Jarre was fired. For a production already racing against the clock, and racing against a much bigger, competing western with a much bigger budget. Losing your director a month and should have been a death blow. What happened next has become one of the more persistent legends in modern Hollywood, and unlike a lot of set gossip, this one turned out to be true. George P. Cosmatos, a director best known for big action fare like Rambo, First Blood Part 2, was brought in to replace Jarre and finish the picture. Officially, Cosmatos received full directing credit, and that credit still appears on the film today. Unofficially, cast and crew have described something closer to a partnership, one where the film star, Kurt Russell, ended up doing far more than acting. Russell stayed quiet about it for years, reportedly out of respect for Cosmatos, who had died in 2005. But once he started speaking more openly in interviews, the picture that emerged was striking. Russell has described bringing Cosmatos on essentially as a ghost director, someone who could hold the official title, while Russell handled a huge amount of the actual creative decision-making behind the scenes, shaping scenes, managing the shot list, keeping continuity intact, and holding the production together during a period when it easily could have collapsed. Val Kilmer backed up that account in blunt terms years later, writing that Russell was the reason the film succeeded at all, and describing the exhausting nightly work Russell put in preparing each day's shots after the crew had already put in a full day on set. It's worth being honest about what is and isn't confirmed here. Nobody is claiming Cosmatos did nothing. By most accounts, he brought real technical experience and an eye for period detail that the production badly needed at that point. What's well documented is that Russell's involvement went far beyond what star of the film usually means, and that the people who were there, Elliott included, in the way he's discussed those chaotic early days in group interviews, have consistently described the production finding its footing specifically because Russell stepped into that gap. One detail that keeps surfacing whenever cast members talk about Tombstone's troubled start. Even after Jarre was fired, his script largely stayed intact. There were changes, pacing adjustments, trims, decisions made to fit the material into a workable running time, and later accounts, including detailed looks back at Jarre's original draft, note that some material was lost in the process, particularly material that gave more depth to the Earp women. But the core of what made the film work, the characters, the dialogue people still quote, the shape of the Earp family story, came from Jarre's original writing. That continuity mattered to the cast. Elliott had signed on because of the writing, and despite everything that went wrong with the production around it, The version of Virgil Earp he ended up playing was still, at its core, the character Jar had put on the page. It's part of why so many people involved in the film have spoken warmly about Jar's contribution, even while acknowledging that he wasn't able to finish what he started. If there's one piece of Tombstone trivia that fans bring up more than almost anything else, it's the mustaches. The film has an unmistakable lived-in look, and a big part of that comes down to a simple production decision. Rather than gluing on fake facial hair, the cast was asked to grow their own. According to actor Michael Biehn, who played Johnny Ringo, that decision traced back to Jar himself, who wanted the mustaches to curl at the ends in the period-accurate style, which meant real hair, real wax, and real patience from the actors. Almost everyone in the principal cast went along with it, and by most accounts wore it as a point of pride. There was exactly one exception. John Tenney, who played Sheriff Johnny Behan, had come off another job that required him to stay clean-shaven and didn't have time to grow one before shooting started. The production solved it the practical way, a fake mustache applied and removed every day of the shoot. Beehn has said, with some affection, that Tenney ended up feeling a little like the odd one out because of it. The one guy on set whose facial hair wasn't the real thing. It's a small detail, but it's exactly the kind of commitment to authenticity story that fans of the film love to pass around, because it says something about how seriously this cast took getting the period right, even down to the upper lip. Getting the look right was only part of it. Tombstone is also remembered for how physically convincing its gunfights feel, especially compared to the more stylized action of a lot of westerns from earlier decades. That didn't happen by accident. The production brought in specialized coaching to teach the cast period-accurate weapon handling, how 19th century gunfighters actually carried, drew, and moved with their firearms, rather than the exaggerated flourishes movies often lean on. The result shows up on screen in small ways that add up. Characters who carry their weapons like they've done it their whole lives, movements that feel economical instead of theatrical, and gunfights that read as tense and grounded rather than choreographed. It's a kind of detail that most audiences absorb without consciously noticing, but it's a big part of why Tombstone has aged so well compared to a lot of its contemporaries. It doesn't feel like actors playing dress-up. It feels like people who know exactly what they're doing. Part of what makes Tombstone's success so satisfying in hindsight is the competition it was up against. While Jar's project was scrambling to stay on schedule with a modest budget, a much larger, prestige-driven western was in the works elsewhere. Kevin Costner's Wyatt Earp, backed by a bigger studio push and a significantly larger budget, telling essentially the same story. At the time, a lot of industry chatter assumed the outcome was obvious. The smaller, scrappier Tombstone would get released first, generate some initial interest, and then get quietly overshadowed once the bigger, more expensive version arrived a few months later. That's not how it played out. Tombstone connected with audiences in a way that its bigger, glossier rival never quite managed. And over time, it's Tombstone that became the Western people actually rewatch and quote, while Wyatt Earp is remembered mostly as a footnote in that same story. The cast has pointed to the same reasons over and over: the tightness of Jar's script, the chemistry of the ensemble, and a sense of urgency and personality that a longer, more sweeping epic didn't have room for. Sometimes the smaller, faster, more focused version of a story just works better than the expensive one, and Tombstone is one of the clearest examples of that in modern film history. Bringing in a new director in the middle of a troubled shoot is never a smooth transition, and by most cast accounts, the early days after Cosmatos took over were tense. People were still adjusting to new leadership, still recovering from the chaos of the previous month, and unsure exactly how the new dynamic on set was going to work. It's a kind of situation where a single bad interaction early on can set a sour tone for the rest of the shoot. Whatever friction existed seems to have resolved itself fairly quickly, and the working relationship between Cosmatos and the cast settled into something functional for the remainder of production, professional, if not always warm, and ultimately productive enough to get the film across the finish line under difficult circumstances. Ask almost anyone who worked on Tombstone which performance still gives them chills, and the answer tends to be the same: Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday. It's become one of those rare cases where a supporting performance ends up defining the entire film in the public imagination, and the reasons for that go beyond just good line delivery. Kilmer reportedly threw himself into the preparation with an intensity that stood out even in a cast full of serious actors, studying the historical Holliday, working on the accent, and finding a physicality for a man dying slowly of tuberculosis that read as genuinely unwell rather than performatively frail. That kind of commitment tends to change the atmosphere on a set, and by most accounts, it did here. Cast members have described a noticeable shift in energy whenever Kilmer's scenes were being filmed. More focus, more attention, less of the usual between-takes chatter. It's a kind of detail that doesn't show up in any official production history, but that keeps surfacing in interviews with the people who were there because it left an impression on them. Whatever was happening off-camera to hold this production together, on camera, everyone involved seemed to sense they were watching something special happen in real time. Part of what makes the Earp brothers convincing on screen is that the actors playing them weren't just hitting marks together. By most accounts, they built something closer to an actual rapport during the shoot. Sam Elliott, Bill Paxton, and Kurt Russell needed to read as brothers who'd grown up together, who trusted each other instinctively and communicated in half sentences and glances. That's a hard thing to fake convincingly on screen if the actors don't have some version of that dynamic off-camera too. Elliott, in particular, brought a set of instincts to westerns that went beyond just professional preparation. He's spoken over the years about his own connection to the American Southwest and to frontier storytelling more broadly, not as an abstract genre interest, but as something that felt close to his own background. That familiarity shows up in the way he plays Virgil, unhurried, plain-spoken, carrying authority without ever needing to raise his voice. Cast and crew members have repeatedly described his performance in almost identical terms: grounded, steady, lived in, which is exactly the kind of consistency you'd expect from an actor who wasn't reaching for a character so much as drawing on something he already understood. That sense of authenticity extended to the way the ensemble worked together as a unit during the shoot itself. A troubled production with a fired director and a compressed schedule can easily turn into a set where everyone is looking out for themselves. By most accounts, that's not what happened on Tombstone. Instead, the cast seems to have pulled closer together in response to the chaos, leaning on each other and on Russell's behind-the-scenes leadership to get through it. It's a dynamic that's easy to romanticize in hindsight, but it lines up with what the people who were there have said again and again. Whatever was falling apart administratively, the people in front of the camera were, if anything, more locked in because of it. Every few years, Tombstone seems to find a new wave of fans, often younger viewers discovering it for the first time through clips, quotes, and online discussion long before they sit down and watch the whole thing. Lines like Kilmer's "I'm your Huckleberry" have taken on a life of their own well outside the context of the film, showing up in memes and conversations from people who may not even know where they originated. That kind of staying power is unusual for a mid-budget Western from the early 90s, and it says something about how well the film's characters were built, despite, or maybe partly because of, how difficult it was to make. It also means the behind-the-scenes stories keep finding new audiences too. Every retrospective interview, every anniversary piece, every cast reunion panel tends to surface a few more details about just how close this film came to falling apart, and just how much work it took from people like Russell, and how much conviction it took from people like Elliott to make sure it didn't. The film's reputation as a scrappy underdog that quietly outlasted its bigger, better-funded rival has become as much a part of its legacy as anything that happens on screen. None of this, the fired director, the ghost directing star, the fake mustache, the gun-handling coaches, the underdog box office story, takes anything away from what ended up on screen. If anything, it makes Tombstone's success more impressive. This wasn't a film that came together easily or according to plan. It was a movie held together by a cast